We're live. And once again. Okay, this should not be a terribly long episode. I know I've posted a few in the past week or so, and hardly anybody's gotten to watch any of them yet, but it doesn't matter because, whichever one draws you in is hopefully the one that leads you to the other ones, blah, blah, blah. And again, they're not meant to be the same bullet point videos as I'm basically critiquing or rebuttaling or whatever. So this one should be much shorter, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, the basic premise, the character interiority, this kind of comes along later in your writing journey, maybe a little bit, along with other buzzwords that academic people like to kind of throw around. And so academic hell has kind of become the publisher shortcuts, because these are the kind of things that they can, bullet point to each other in memos or whatever, or have, run the gamut through the literary circles of people who don't write books, but read them for a living or whatever. And so, yeah, they can have a checklist of things to look for in your manuscript that maybe you didn't think of while you were writing your manuscript. So becoming aware of these terms is kind of what these YouTube videos are helpful for. And this isn't going to be just a list of those terms, but a delve into the characteristics of one of those terms or whatever. So basically, in this case, we're looking at the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of said main character, POV character, although you might have some of this to a lesser extent with other characters, or you might have multiple main characters, blah, blah, blah. Okay. My initial reaction or, resistance to this premise of the source material is character interiority the thing that is really lacking in most submitted stories these days? I would say probably not. I would say most of you aren't struggling with this, doing it. Maybe you're not doing it very well. We'll get into that. But doing it, I think most writers only want to show this now, kind of, especially again with the late 1800s kind of things starting to shift from third person to first person narration a lot more. First person narration is all character interiority, almost, except for where the character is describing what they see. Mostly they're telling you what they think and feel. So if you're writing in first person, again, your execution might be the problem more than your lack. Sorry, I'm fidgeting because my hat's a little small because I was going to wear a different one, and then this one matched the sweater better. Okay, anyway, like I said, short video. I try not to fidget too much. Okay, but yes, apart from spectacle in like a fantasy novel or a horror novel where you have, maybe creatures and stuff and a whole world that you've, doing world building. So there's all this extra descriptive language and that sort of thing. Or gratuitous romantic scenes, and not just romance books, but elsewhere, just kind of thrown in there too for, whatever reason to, goose the reader or shock the reader or whatever. Or your writing teacher said it's missing a romance, and you didn't understand that they meant actual romance, not just physical encounters. I don't know. The character, I think there was a little bit of gray area here where the previous content creator was saying they want, the personality to really come out. I think a lot of times that the character doesn't necessarily have a personality. It's the writer's personality coming through, or nowadays more their fantasy self-persona rather than their actual personality, because their actual personality is someone who sits alone in a room consuming mass pop culture and then trying to create their own or something. I'm not trying to, overgeneralize and stereotype what your typical amateur writer might look like today. But if you fit into these categories, but you really wish you were, Han Solo or the princess or something, and you know you're not, like, that's not necessarily a bad thing to kind of try and infuse yourself or infuse. I'm just saying, know when you're writing the character versus when you're trying to write yourself, I guess, especially if you're doing, again, not third person narration, but the other omniscient, whatever the class, there's like 3 classifications or whatever. So there's, again, kind of gray areas where it's your voice overarching the whole thing and you're not a non-player character. I always had this problem when I was in college, and I think some of the times the teachers were wrong and some of the times they were right. When they were wrong, they were saying stuff like, how would he know this? And it's like, well, I didn't say he knew that. I'm telling the reader this information. But they were saying it was too confusing, where it seemed like I was giving the character insight into other characters that they wouldn't necessarily have, often based on physical attributes, such as like, she's Asian. How does he know she's Japanese? And it's like, well, there's a whole slew of reasons why he might know she's Japanese, but let's put that aside now. Okay, it's Yoko Ono, and he already knows who she is. Who cares? That wasn't actually the case in the story, but, like, I'm the narrator. I'm allowed to tell you their nationality if I think it's relevant, right? Whereas, again, a lot of writers do overstep this bound, and suddenly the character's like, he looked at her, he knew she was, against this. And, well, body language can convey that. You just have to, like I said, expand on that and make it a little clearer so your writing teacher isn't going, hey, and it's like, I took one look at you and knew you didn't like my story. That didn't take long. I didn't know why, but now I do. We had this interaction, so that cleared that up. Great. Anyway, so it says, let's see, I'm just reading my notes here, so forgive me because I can't always remember exactly where I was in the video. Invites reader to fully inhabit point of view's internal space. Yes, that is the point of internal characteriority thing. So you get their experience as a reader viscerally. So again, these writing teachers, I guess, felt that they weren't getting the characters' POV viscerally, or they felt they were getting too much of it because they were reading it wrong or something. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. Essential component of, I guess, good writing, or what these publisher types or editor types are looking for. And then it goes on to say, also, it's the whole point of reading fiction is to enjoy this sense of the character's experience. And I'm not even sure that is true. I think that depends partly on the narrative, maybe. Like Frankenstein, yes, but an action book, maybe not so much. A pulp fiction detective, I don't necessarily really care what he's thinking. Whereas Sherlock Holmes, maybe a little bit more. There's like a nuance there. Yeah, I don't always really actually give a crap what is going on in my main character's head, or somebody else's main character actually, in a book that I've picked up. Now, when I'm writing a main character, and again, like I said, I think this is already true for most of you, we're already invested, or we wouldn't be sitting here typing the thing in the first place. Again, depending a little bit on your genre, a little bit on your intent. If you're just writing it because you think it's going to sell $1 million because you're going to rewrite Friday the 13th or whatever and not put any thought into it, then maybe it will. I'm not saying it can't, because obviously there's other types of movies like that, but they usually have some spin on them that makes them unique enough that people watch those too, instead of just saying, oh, this one's better, don't watch those, right? Although they are a bit cookie cutter, to be quite frank. And I'm not going to talk about screenplays too much here, but again, as always, this will go into screenplays a little bit in a minute, so it's not totally off limits, but Let's see, essential component. Yes, we covered that. Novels allow this access, unlike other forms of entertainment, like screenplays, because yes, we were leading right to there. Because we can live more vicariously through the character. This connection and investment becomes the primary kind of thing for, according to her, most readers. Again, getting swept off your feet while reading a romance, or getting hooked into the suspense of reading a thriller, that kind of thing. Yes, okay, we agree. They did not provide any cinematic examples, but I will. Now, this is where they've attempted a POV narrative for kind of a first person thing, but it's cinematically done. So, Dark Passage with Humphrey Bogart, and there was like an episode of MASH, I think the one with Ron Howard. I'm not, if memory serves. And there might be some other examples. Again, some of those horror movies, I think you see from Behind the Mask or whatever, but you're seeing what they see, but you're not getting their thoughts, right? So yes, there were attempts made for this visual, but mostly when we get interior characterizations or character interiorities, whatever that was called, in a film, it's usually all through voiceover. And I don't think we had any voiceover. We had character interaction in the MASH episode where the actual character was wounded and he couldn't talk, and he had a trach tube or something. So Hawkeye was saying, "Don't try to talk, don't try to talk," and the main characters were doing all the talking, and the camera had no response until the very end when he goes, "Thank you." Okay, so if you haven't seen it, spoiler, but just to clarify that. So we didn't get any voiceover in the character's head, and the only words we got was somebody off screen saying two whole words at the end of the program. Okay. Dark Passage, we do get Humphrey Bogart's voice because he interacts with other characters and he doesn't have, throat surgery, and which is, not a usual common thing for characters to have to endure. But he does have plastic surgery, so he's kind of bandaged and not himself until the very end when there's the big reveal. Spoiler alert. Okay. If you haven't seen Dark Passage, whatever. Again, not falling into the typical voiceover category. So like there's plenty of others though, like Apocalypse Now, where there's voiceover on the whole thing. Blade Runner, where that doesn't just give the characters interiority, but also gives complete backstory of other characters that have their own interiorities that we don't hear as much, but get a third person, or not third person, but second party reveal and third party reveals in other whatever. Party, not person. Yeah. Blade Runner, one that people often actually complain about, saying that the narration is too much, it's over the top, it's not necessary to explain what's going on. But again, Blade Runner trying to be like those Pulp Fiction detective novels. I talked about this in a previous video already. And I talked about Apocalypse Now in a different context. Stand By Me being one where now the narrator has grown up and he's, reflecting back while he's actually writing a novel. So he's giving the character interiority to us, the film audience, that is not necessarily getting infused into the book he's writing, oddly enough. He's explaining the book to us as if we have some reason to care about his memory, which is interesting enough on its own, I guess. So that's kind of an odd one. I don't know how much of that narration was in the original Stephen King story. It's been a long time since I've read it, so somebody can remind me, oh yeah, that was all in there, or no, none of that was in there. Rob Reiner did a great job, fine, whatever. Another one I've talked about before, Platoon. Definitely we're getting the interior of the character there a lot in his letters to his grandma, but as the film goes on, they drop off considerably. So they start off quite a bit at first, and then after a while, it's kind of like, what's going on. He's not writing to his grandma that much, and what's he going to say about all this anyway to her? So that all kind of goes by the wayside mostly. And then there's kind of a summation at the end where he gets all philosophical, but that's again him talking directly, or Oliver Stone using him to talk directly to the audience more than, again, the older version looking back more than the younger character writing a letter. So it's a little heavy-handed there, but nobody seems to care. And there's also crawls, although I don't think there's too much of a crawl on Platoon compared to like the famous Star Wars thing, but that gives mostly exteriors, not interiors. That gives the backstory in the situation, not the character's thoughts. We don't know who Luke Skywalker is in most of them, but in some of them it does introduce specific characters as the trilogy went on, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. Breakfast Club, another movie I've talked about a few times. This only, as far as I remember, bookends the story with some voiceover narration, and it's all from the one guy who's writing the essay for the group, and so we get to read his thoughts in the form of the essay through his voice in the teacher's mind, or the principal's mind, or the dean, I guess I should say. Vice principal? Is he the vice principal? Same. In my high school, it would have been the dean. In their high school, I think it was the vice principal. Whatever. The authority figure, the adult. So I find that this type of voiceover is less used in comedies overall, although I suppose you could compare that. I'm not sure about all fiction, how that's always approached, but I was thinking about Douglas Adams. Of course, The Hitchhiker's Guide movie had a lot of voiceover to explain the whole thing, whereas, you know, most kind of don't. It's all sight gags and things, right? And of course, they never ended up making the sequels to those, or that particular film, whereas there was sequels in the books. So the movie that made no sense, but had different point of views, kind of, but no voiceover that I recall, was The Shining, right? Sure. I just thought I'd throw that one in there. So supposedly this character, Interiority, hooks the reader and stays with them after they finish the book. Sure, I guess. Again, I can totally recall most of the books I've read lately, right? Now, even more than a bunch of those old ones. Yeah, again, it depends on how well it was done, how much I was really invested versus if I was, reading it for a class, whatever. Again, for most of you, if you're actually watching this, you want it to make a lasting impression if, when you use it. And I'm not saying you should never use it because it's automatically bad. I'm not disagreeing with the premise of the video. I'm just throwing up some roadblocks and some shade because, again, we want to make sure we're doing it properly, correctly. We want to make sure we're not butting heads with our writing teachers, no matter how incompetent they might seem at times, whatever. How to incorporate. So here was the tactical techniques, interior versus their physical responses. So again, the action novel guy, we might be getting some or none of this interior, but overall in most books, again, yes, part of the point of writing the book instead of the screenplay is showing, not telling, to go beyond just physical, add emotional depth and context for the why behind character reaction. So again, sometimes you don't necessarily need a ton of that either. Like a kung fu movie, you hit Nan Po. Nan Po's my friend. I hit you. That's, there's not a lot of motivation there. Sometimes they hit the wrong guy and find out later, no, that was Nan Po's uncle. You shouldn't have fought with him. He was the guy who was going to give you a job, stuff like that. Can be a twist. So sometimes we don't want to know what they know or think they know because it's a reveal of a sort later, as I just outlined or expressed or whatever. But for the most part, lens of the POV, not just what the camera could capture, like we talked about with MASH. Okay. So the ways to accomplish this was, one, straight narration. This is your description of emotional response. For instance, emotional response doesn't necessarily mean laughing or crying or that kind of thing, but it's generating emotional response in the reader through empathy or whatever with the character. Okay. 2, direct thoughts. This is presented in straight narration. Again, that's not the first person. That's the author giving us that description and telling us what's in their head. Whereas direct thoughts is the character themselves telling us, again, Catcher in the Rye, in first person or close third person, which is when the author is telling us their thoughts, but maybe or maybe not in quotations, sometimes in italics. And then the third was free indirect discourse. This was not explained very well. The explanation, it made it sound like we're back to number 1, but it is actually slightly different. There's a different video that talked about this better that I saw before, and that's the reason I can explain it to you now. Whereas if I just watched this video, I would be totally confused right here. It's also thoughts related through the narrator, but not just with more words, although that's kind of the way it was explained. It's not presented as thought, but more a narrator question that's really still the character's either unconscious thought or a thought they should have had but don't. And so in the other video explanation, it was about like a guy who has like no fear or bravado or just no common sense, and he's going to walk across a bridge, and that bridge could be unstable. And we're saying, he has no heed for the thought that that bridge might collapse, but he walks out on it anyway. Whereas in a first person narration, he would be saying, oh, I wonder if that bridge is going to hold my weight. Whereas this character isn't worried about that at all for whatever reason. Okay, so I didn't necessarily explain it as well as the other guy did, but I'm not just trying to cut and paste other people's thoughts. Like I said, I just thought that would be a little more helpful, if that makes sense, which probably didn't, but it doesn't matter because, again, most of the time we're not writing a character that clueless, and if we are, we're already compensating for that without overthinking it. Okay. So literally when I've seen, I don't know, video clips or something, when they do the man on the street thing, they say, do you like reading? No, I hate books, that kind of thing. I think a lot of this is the kind of stuff why non-literary people hate reading books, just kind of bluntly, not necessarily, I don't know, because they don't want to care about what the characters are thinking or something, but they're not necessarily invested. I don't know, the teachers are having a hard time getting them to share the enthusiasm for this work, but the work is just too bogged down with this kind of stuff and not enough action, I guess, is my concern with the kind of things that are typically assigned literature. So I'm kind of, like I said, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but again, if you're doing it well, if you're doing it correctly, you're the author. That's not your problem, where it ends up, but you do want the reader to be satisfied, which again, at the top, the gal said was the point of doing this in the first place, was to make the book more enjoyable. So again, caution that you're making it more enjoyable, not less, because we hopefully are not just writing these things, and these buzzword principles are not just for publisher geeks who, feel some self-importance about, knowing all these terms and stylistic choices, when, maybe they wish they could be authors instead of editors. I don't know. This comes back to what I was talking about 2 or 3 videos ago about Thomas Wolfe, where the criticism was that the editor had hijacked the actual work. But of course, the work was so long that no average reader was ever going to plunk down money for it or get through the entire thing if he had published it as is. And I talked about this in the previous video, all about the very previous video, but I didn't talk about the Thomas Wolfe thing again because I didn't belabor the point, but about writers who don't believe that they should ever have to face an editor. And of course, the famous one I used there instead was Jack Kerouac, because he's maybe slightly more well-known than Thomas Wolfe now. Then in another video, not related, but I'm relating it here because I think it does warrant some consideration. And this is my last point, and this is longer than I thought it would be, but whatever. Books on tape being easier to process rather than reading, or does it just save time? I think that the jury is out and the opinion varies. I think some people believe that actually physically reading does make more of an impression in your brain than just listening to it. Although he was saying that, you know, maybe you're getting somebody who acts it out a little bit. So you're not seeing physical things, but you're getting inflection, you're getting voice. So maybe you're getting a little more invested in the story. Maybe you're getting a little more out of the story. But my caveat to that, though, is typically when are people listening to books on tape? Usually when they're doing something else, like cleaning the house or even listening while driving. Yeah, you can listen while you're driving, but you're distracted still unless you're, you know, completely parked in traffic for more than half an hour. And I'm putting aside the myth of multitasking in other areas as, you know, as being problematic. Here, I'm just going to say, you know, how often does one really take a 6-hour road trip up and, you know, up I-5 in the long stretch above LA County where it's totally straight, totally flat, and you can just listen to a book and not have to concentrate on the road too much. Yeah, if you did that, you could finish a standard length book in one go, maybe. But how many trips to Sacramento and back does War and Peace require? I don't know. You know, I mean, when I'm reading something, it typically is 6 to 8 hours for a non-speed reading average. So if a guy's reading and acting it out, he's not, you know, he's, hey, don't do that. You know, no, I'm parked here. You know, they're acting it out again. I think assume more. I don't know. I've never really gotten into books on tape on principle, but that would be my concern as to why you might not be absorbing them in the same capacity. And so with that, if you have any disagreements or comments or questions and things or still need some clarification, of course, do leave them in the comments. And, well, this was only half an hour when I thought it would be like 12 minutes, but still, if you're interested in this topic, you've made it this far, maybe, and we'll see how it goes. I don't know what the next one will be, but it won't be immediately as much as soon as some of these other ones, probably. I'll try and space it out a little bit more and all that. Okay, and tomorrow is the first day of spring, and I have no video planned for that whatsoever, but deserves honorable mention. Okay.